Hello and welcome. Thank you all for being here today. It's November 3rd, 2021. I am Nick Knoke, the Director of Technology for the Asset Leadership Network, and I am very excited for our conversation today about equity and asset leadership. But before we get underway, I just want to thank our patron sponsors, Definitive Logic, Onuma System, ABS Quality Evaluations, and ABS Group. We are really grateful for their continued support. We couldn't do programs like this in our newsletter without that support. We're also grateful for the continued support of our organizational members, especially Strategies Insight with Cecilia Mowatt today. And we just want to note the Andrew James Advisory Group is launching an ALN A55K professional certification course starting December 6th. And there are limited seats available. So if you're interested in that sort of ISO 55000 based professional development, please reach out to the Andrew James Advisory Group or anyone at the ALN. And with that, I would just say, if you're out there watching, we would love to hear from you. So please send any comments, questions, or feedback to the chat, and we will try to get those questions answered and add those topics to the discussion queue. And with that, I will pass it to Mike Bordenero, Director of Communications for the ALN, to make more introductions and start us off.
Thank you, Nick. It is quite the pleasure today to be facilitating this Advancing Equity with Asset Leadership Roundtable. The surprise winner of the year has been equity in asset management. This group of talented people have done an incredible job of promoting a discussion of equity around asset management. And today we'll be having Chris Silkie. He is the asset manager for Parks and Recreation in the city of Portland, Oregon, talk about the recently passed, unanimously passed, asset management policy. And Cecilia Mowatt, who is president of Strategy Insight and the co-chair of this Advancing Equity with Asset Leadership Board, will be talking, as will Mildred. Mildred is the recently appointed Knowledge Leadership Group chair for the Institute of Asset Management. And we have also made her an ALN Senior Fellow. So we're looking forward to how she bridges our organizations. And Toby Kizner, welcome to Toby. Her first participation in one of our panels is the Director of Operations at AMCL in the US. And Director of Technology, Nick Knoke, is going to be joining this discussion also, not just be running the tech behind us. So it sounded as if we have Chris. Chris is with us now, and I'm going to be advancing the PowerPoint slide for Chris to talk about this incredible Resolution 37551, which was adopted unanimously by the Portland, Oregon City Council. Here is a link to the document, and we'll put that in the chat later on. So Chris, 2.5-year journey, you said this was?
Yeah, that's a little bit more than that. You know, with COVID, things kind of got cramped together. But yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about our policy development process. But first, I want to thank you, Mike, and also our esteemed panelists and guests for inviting me to this. You know, the ALN has been no small influence on some of the words that you might read in this policy, as well as some of my own thoughts, and that I've been able to represent those to the bigger group here in Portland. Mm-hmm. And I want to first make a disclaimer and some acknowledgements, and then talk a little bit about the road we traveled with the development of the policy, and then just highlight some key elements. So first, I just want to share that I'm here of my own accord. I'm not here as an official spokesperson for the city of Portland nor for Portland Parks and Recreation. However, I will say that I'm highly supported in this endeavor, and as well as supporting equity by using asset management as a tool, as well as networking with others and identifying best practices and advancing best practices. I am here as kind of a representative for a group of 5 people who really, over the last two and a half, 3 years, we met every week for about an hour and a half for that first year to kind of hash out a policy. And so I want to list their names. One is Emily Trish from Transportation, and she's now with the City of Tigard. Doug Stewart was with our water utility. He's now retired. And I just want to share that Doug was also one of the original authors of the International Infrastructure Management Manual. Maddie Souter, who was with an electric utility and now with facilities. And then Dr. Shannon Reynolds, who was with our wastewater and stormwater utility. So the policy reflects multi-sectors. And then I'm with Portland Parks and Recreation. It reflects the efforts of all those sectors and a large group of people. And what we wanted to do was lift all boats in terms of asset management, and then also lift all boats in terms of using asset management as a tool to advance the objectives of equity. So that room that developed that core policy still isn't representative of all the different categories of infrastructure, but all those different industries are at different levels of maturity when it comes to asset management. And then even within organizations, I'm sure most of the listeners would probably acknowledge within their own organization, there's subgroups that are at different levels of maturity when it comes to asset management. So for the road we traveled, I'll share a little bit of background, which is that the city of Portland has had a policy on racial equity since 2015. And every city employee attends what they call Equity 101, just kind of setting the baseline and understanding of the importance and some of the history of the United States and the history of our city around racial equity. So that's kind of the baseline understanding. And then as asset managers, we've been meeting as a group, my predecessor, since around 2000. So you have these two kind of threads going where there's a desire to get at a common level of understanding and a common framework. And that was kind of the impetus for starting the work on this policy. So, you know, as I see it, there's several ways that the tools of asset management really apply to advancing the needs and the mandates of racial equity. And one of those, I'll just give a very specific example, is a good asset management program is comprehensive. And so you work to identify needs in a comprehensive manner, whether that's service gaps or maintenance needs. And once you have that information, you can start identifying where there are disparities, and you can start showing where those disparities may be. And so that provides an opportunity to address racial inequities. And one thing we do know is that those racial inequities are literally baked into our infrastructure system. You know, look at the history of housing policy, you look at the history of transportation policies, access to nature, tree canopy, you name it, across the board, there are infrastructure inequities. So being able to address those disparities is a tool that asset management can bring to those racial equity goals. The second way is by process. So a good asset management program is going to identify the processes that you're using to allocate resources, to prioritize, and start working on things. And what we know is that if there is no process, then self-empowered advocates are going to drive decisions. And we know that that is not an equitable approach. So by really daylighting the processes and clarifying decision points, clarifying the inputs to those decisions, asset management can help advance equity that way. And then I'll just touch on the last and third way, which is by being fiscally responsible, by looking at the full life cycle of needs of your total base of your asset portfolio, we're able to plan for generational equity and really, look at the long term. We know that the United States is becoming more diverse in many of our cities. I know Portland is becoming more diverse. And so there's this intergenerational equity aspect, and asset management is well positioned as a tool to help advance that. So those are kind of the three threads that are woven throughout the policy and what we're trying to do. And I think I saw a question from Cecilia. Did I see that right? Oh no. Okay.
No, not yet. I'm just saying amen to a couple of things that you said. The self-imposed advocates was a big one that, asset management helps with that. So please continue.
Yeah, thank you. So every organization out there is going to have a different framework for developing a policy. For us, we started with this core group of 5, really hashed it out, got it to a level where there was agreement. And, again, we have multiple industries being represented. So that took some time to get to where there's agreement, and then broaden the circle and continually broaden the circle until it got to a point where it was ready to bring to city council. They had a work session on it and then passed it unanimously. But it's just the starting line. So what this is a statement of expectations, a statement of roles and responsibilities, and then there's a mechanism for continuous improvement and daylighting sort of where different parts of an organization are at regarding asset management. So those are the 3 core elements of this policy. I'd also just like to add an example of what you emphasized, Cecilia. I'm sure this exists in many organizations, but we've actually tracked this and we've looked at who calls, who advocates, and compared that with some of those comprehensive system-wide assessment results. And we know that some of the areas of highest need, it's not who's calling, that's not who's exercising political influence. And so the onus is on the organization to really have that strong information, that rock solid data, the rock solid information, the rock solid business process. So when those calls come, they're going to come. And when the political pressure comes, and it's going to come, you can have this, here's how we do it. And here's why we're doing it. And this is the trade-off. If you say go over there, that means we're not going over here. And this is where the need is. And so I think that's a really important aspect of any program, is to really take that comprehensive approach and to be able to develop that rock solid information. So,
Chris, if I could amplify that, we had on a previous program, Malik Barami with the Fairfax County Parks and Recreation Department. And he said, he said the same thing, that the areas that needed the most road work or other that could have the biggest case to make for why money should be invested in their area, they weren't calling. They didn't have either the luxury of time to spend, time on hold or advocate. They didn't have the power to advocate for themselves, the people who needed it the most. And just like you're saying, that's why it's so important to have a structured approach, a comprehensive approach with clear stated roles and responsibilities and outreach to get stakeholder engagement, not waiting for stakeholders to come to you and tell you what they need and make a good case for why they deserve it. So just to amplify that point, it's been said before, and I hope it gets said a lot more, and I hope people hear it.
Yeah, thank you. So I don't know, should we walk through some of the policy elements with the PowerPoint? Would that be helpful, Mike?
Yes,
Sure.
so comprehensive, so please do.
So first of all, oh wait, I've got to share my screen. One second.
So as you're getting that together, I just want to say, Chris, it's been such a pleasure to have you on our Advancing Equity with Asset Leadership Board, and you've been such a contributor. When you get into this, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are about the work we've been doing at ALN, including your being such a big part of our white paper. And we'll talk about that afterwards, but just as a point to put in the parking lot.
Great, thank you. Yeah, you know, I should probably address part of that right now, which is, you know, the policy had been in development for a little over 2 years. I think, like many organizations and many people, George Floyd's murder caused us to stop and say, wait a minute, you know, what's going on? What are we doing? And are we doing enough? And I would say it wasn't completely rewritten, but it was heavily revised. And around the same time of those revisions was when I found out about the ALN. So that was a little over a year ago, and it watched the session with Mark Morial, and that was very inspiring. And you know, that whole time it was in the background going, yes, yes. And so that's what prompted me to reach out. And so likewise, I really appreciate the dialogue. I think these dialogues are necessary. And if I had a hope out of this session today, it would be that some ideas and some inspiration take hold in many organizations. And plagiarism is highly encouraged. You know, please, you know, take the elements of this policy that make sense for your organization, make it your own. And you know, it's we're learning, and that's, we're learning about, many organizations are learning about asset management, and we're learning about equity, and it's a continual process. So let's put those together. You know, we're learning about both of them, and let's fuse them and make asset management support the goals of racial equity. And having that personal readiness to have those conversations is vital. And so just like organizations are at different states of readiness regarding the tools of asset management, many individuals and many organizations are at different states of readiness regarding racial equity. So I would say that that's probably a prerequisite. We wouldn't have been able to do this had we not had that policy in 2015, the all citywide, everyone receiving the same training and so on. So I think that is necessary, as well as continual investment in yourself, taking courses, self-study, talking to people is also necessary. So why don't we walk through just a few of the things. In the first clause, one thing I'll just point out, the word natural and built physical infrastructure. You know, the wordsmithing in this, there's probably a half-hour debate around just this first clause. Making sure that natural infrastructure gets parity with built infrastructure is vital. The statistics around access to nature are very somber, and a lot of jurisdictions in Canada have actually elevated natural infrastructure to be on par with built infrastructure in terms of treatment through asset management. So that was a little bit of a required advocacy to include natural infrastructure in that. So the trees, the parkland, community gardens, and so on. The next clause, it's a necessary acknowledgement, racist practices, disparities, generational inequities. There's systematic root causes of all of those. You know, redlining was a very deliberate effort, a deliberate policy effort to marginalize people. And it's going to take, you know, a systematic approach to undo that. And we're living with those consequences of those historic racist practices today. And so it's important to acknowledge that. And that's where you get into the next clause. The structured approach of asset management offers proven methodologies to deliver long-term public value. And care for natural and built assets enables fiscal responsibility, sustainability, and equity. And then we acknowledge a little bit of the prior work. And then you can keep scrolling down, please. And then there's an acknowledgement of future generations, like sustainability, like equity, asset management. It's an investment. And, you know, for many organizations that don't have a well-established program, convincing those with the purse strings to make the leap and invest in the services and resources necessary to even advance asset management sometimes requires a leap, because the return on investment is not immediate, but it'll come. You'll get there, but it might be a few years away. And so that requires a bit of a leap of faith. However, it's not that much of a leap when you start looking at the research and understanding that this is out there. You know, they're doing this all over the world. And if you're not on board, you should get on board. Next, we're acknowledging the role that everyone plays. And then we get into the structure of within the city, how we do it. And then we get into the resolutions. And so I just want to pause on this one for a minute. And the first, be it further resolved, which is an annual asset management maturity tool that then all the sub-organizations are required to fill out, and then they include it in the public budget process. So the idea here is that there is an annual accountability mechanism where there's transparency around it, because our budget process gets a lot of attention. I'm sure for many jurisdictions, that's the case. And so incorporating that into the policy is where that accountability and continuous improvement come in. And then we get into some more roles and responsibilities. So I think that's kind of the synopsis of the overarching policy. And then the appendix gets into more detail about the structure, the facets. I think if you looked towards IAM or ISO or IPWEA, some of those organizations, there would be many common elements to what you'll see in the more detailed policy applied to our setting. So
I just wanted to scroll through real quick to get everybody a kind of understanding of the comprehensiveness of this document.
Yeah, thank you. And lastly, I'll stop talking in just 1 second. There's one that I do want to point out, and I'll read it. I'm not sure if you can find it, but it says, include asset management training and skill development programs, including methods to diversify the profession and the practice of asset management. Like, even within the profession, it's not nearly diverse enough. So embedding that aspect into the policy as well makes for a stronger program, and it makes for a stronger practice overall. So putting effort towards that becomes really important also. So thank you.
I had it.
That's interesting because, of course, one of the things that we say when you're trying to systematize any kind of a DEI program or looking at equity in general is you must start with the man in the mirror. You mentioned self-awareness, self-improvement, but the organization must start with itself first. So I find that interesting that you raised that one. And the one that is so important, which the committee, the board itself, the Advancing Equity Through Asset Leadership, really worked hard to create that overlay in the white paper that we did together that you were a part of, to make sure that we focus people on ISO 55000 4.2. And the whole reason of using this tool that excites me, as opposed to the traditional diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, is the fact that it is a framework that, as you mentioned, is a common understanding and then a common framework that can be used across the organization, that raises the issue of equity without it being as triggering as your traditional DEI or anti-racist, because nobody wants to be called an anti-racist or a racist, even though we all are, including yours truly. We all have our prejudices. We can't help it because it's systemic. So this policy is excellent in terms of what you all have put together, but more important of what it is not just the paper, it's the fact that it is law and will require measurement. And what gets measured gets done. What is required gets done. So kudos, as they say.
Yeah, congratulations for sure. This is a momentous moment. That was wrong, but Mildred has been around policy for many years. Have you ever seen anything like this, Mildred?
No, I have not. It's phenomenal. In fact, what I wanted to add there is the sustainability of it, you know, generation after generation. I mean, this policy actually like embeds that in it as well, not just equity. So as Cecilia has said, it's very broad, it's holistic, it captures, you know, all the latest and greatest areas right now that people are focusing on to incorporate into asset management, but then just being sustainable over time, right? Because it will live on, and it's in the right position for like a continuous improvement path, right? As long as you get that support, you know, politically, which I think is great. I mean, jealous that you have this leadership support, that you're able to get this done, because that's the first step, and that usually does not exist in the way to enable something like this to happen. I can speak from my experience how difficult it is to even get a basic policy, let alone something like this that's just overlaid with all the right ingredients to make it so holistic. So congratulations, Chris. I mean, I did say in the chat, I'd like to really like bring this to the IAM as an example of here is what good looks like. We're all around the world talking about equity, about diversity, about resiliency, about sustainability. And here is a policy, okay, that really like resonates with all of these very important factors. So, and I've already started talking about this at the IAM circles, and they're very interested. So I'm just letting you know that this is really great. Congratulations, really, really proud to be working with you, looking at you and listening to you and learning from you. Thank you.
Yeah. Toby, what do you think as someone who does consulting on asset management on a regular basis globally? What are your thoughts?
So I mirror many of Mildred's comments because I have never, this is so best in class. I've never seen a policy that incorporates addresses racial equity in this way. So I'm very impressed. And I actually, just in terms of my ability to share this with some of the organizations that we support, I have some questions, Chris. I'd love to know some, like, the thought process behind some of what went into this. You mentioned before the annual requirement of a maturity assessment for each department, which is amazing in its own right. But how does that, how does the maturity assessment address understanding of or impact to racial equity within Portland? And then also, how is it sort of weighted to, how does that impact maybe the investment prioritization process, or what's done with that maturity assessment?
Yeah, so, the policy just passed about a couple months ago. so let's reconvene in 3 years and we'll tell you how it went. So we're in the process right now of developing that assessment. What I'll share is kind of what's drafted, and really it's trying to be simple and making yes nos. Like, did you analyze your asset base or your service levels for racial disparities? Yes or no? That sort of thing? Yes or no? Did you act on the analysis results to address racial disparities? Yes or no? And so that's one example, and that is in the draft. It's not, it's not finalized. The question about prioritization right now within the city of Portland, most sub parts of the organization do have what is often termed a racial equity lens that's brought to bear on investment prioritization, and that can take multiple different forms, from questions about, who did you engage in developing this investment plan, to demographics, like just looking at the ACS results of, planned investment area, that sort of thing. And I'd say all of those tools are in play, and part of this process helps daylight, where there's differences, where different parts of the organization might be using, different aspects of the tool, or those kinds of tools. And I imagine that that's happening all over the country too, is that, those different types of racial equity lenses are being brought to bear. And I think at its most basic level, it's using census information, but we know there's potential risks and pitfalls with that. Mm-hmm. And there's some that are more involved. So I think the country and the industry is learning right now too about all this. So I don't know that there's one, this is the way it should be done. Like, I don't know that exists, because there's a lot of experimentation happening right now.
That's absolutely the case. And through some of our other programs that we've had recently, especially the infrastructure program, we have been discussing the need for a national standard for equity in terms of asset management, and looking at that and working with different groups to do that. When you talk about who did you engage, part of the issue is starting with a baseline, who's normally engaged. And you guys actually have that, because you mentioned that you track who calls in. And now this is going to be your time to start tracking who do you reach out to, and doing what I always say: get on the bus, go beyond the usual suspects. So get on the bus with who is going to be at the table and who are you inviting. And you've done some of that work in the past, in the work you did through the park district and expanding and choosing which parks to invest in. So I think you've got tools and examples that you can use. But we are looking at a national standard. And Mike, you might talk a little bit more about that if you want.
Yeah, we're going to take the Portland logo off, and we're going to put the United States logo on, and I think we're set.
No, because they've got, that's not the standard for the performance.
I know.
Standard. That's the standard for putting it in writing and institutionalizing it.
Yes.
Now we're at the point now where Chris is going to begin, and you can talk a little bit about the work you're going to be doing with the university there. You're going to be looking at implementation and figuring out the best practices that you can use, and we'll be there to help alongside that as we work on the national standards piece of this. What measurements, what kind of KPIs for communities, for cities, for local governments would make sense to start measuring? So we'll all collaborate on that. Oh, yes, KPIs. I hate lack of inclusion is use of acronyms. So each of us, as we use our acronyms, key performance indicators, IAM, Institute for Asset Management. We need to share that because we do invite others to the table. I will be making sure that the folks at the IEDC, International Economic Development Council, will have some insights on the work we're doing here, because they're looking at toolkits for dealing with racial disparity and equity, eliminating racial inequities in economic development. So that's an organization that we'll be collaborating with as well. So when I think about this, you also talked about the service levels. That's another place to use as a barometer or a benchmark, right? Where are you today and when does it increase across the board so that more people are getting your desired level of service?
That's right. I think one of the examples in the white paper had to do with tree canopy, and sadly, the correlation of poor tree canopy coverage with race and low income. And we know the benefits of higher tree canopy includes reduce better health outcomes, community health, public health. People live longer, lower stress levels, on and on and on and on for tree canopy. Yet we know that there's sadly a correlation there. So where do you focus your planting programs? Where do you focus your tree preservation programs? And so on. And so that's just a pretty basic example, as well as where does it matter more to focus your effort, following that example, where there's a lot of single family zoned residential lots that have a lot of private trees, or perhaps where there's more multifamily and not as many private trees. So you have to look at things holistically regarding service levels. So it's, and then it's also, is the asset being provided equitably, but also the quality of the asset itself. I think in transportation, some examples I've heard have to do with street lighting, sidewalks, all those sorts of things. So yeah, there may be streets there, but is it a gravel road? Or are there sidewalks on both sides of the street? Is there adequate lighting on both sides of the street? Is the lighting maintained? Is it well functioning everywhere that it's needed? So yeah, that's an example, and that's why that yes, no. I think it's a simple question for every organization. Have they analyzed their service levels for racial disparities? And hopefully many organizations can say yes, and if they say no, that's okay. Like, that's the other thing. And it became really important in getting this policy to pass, was there was some feedback of like, whoa, this is an impossible policy. This is going to cost a fortune for us to meet. And, we're not there on all these elements. It's like, that's okay. To know where you are, though, is really important. And then to make progress is necessary. So it's okay if the answer is no, but the answer shouldn't be no 10 years in a row. So that's.
Now that you have the policy to record this, people will have to be transparent, and hopefully that transparency will allow them to take corrective action. And we've got a flurry of questions and discussion going on. And I wanted to tie in one of the questions with something I was curious about. You spent 2.5 years developing this. Are there any lessons learned that you could share with other people who might want to do a similar action, have a equity-laced asset management policy that might help them address it quicker? And can you explain a little bit further about how the Black Lives Matter movement that started with George Floyd, or it was enhanced by George Floyd's murder, impacted your thinking?
Yeah, in terms of lessons learned, the group of 5 of us that I mentioned at the beginning, it was kind of a side of our desk project, for that 2.5 years. It wasn't necessarily, hey, you 5 are commissioned to craft this policy. So it was a little bit of I won't say grassroots, but maybe, only partway up the tree effort. And it certainly would have been easier if there were top-down direction to, okay, this is the chartering, this group of people are going to develop this policy of 6 months to do it. And then, we're going to vet it, and then we're going to pass it, and then we're going to devote resources to implementation. That certainly would be easier, and that certainly would happen faster. So kudos to the organizations that have the wisdom to embark on such an effort.
Well, kudos to you for establishing the template that makes it easier for top leaders to understand the value of this. So yeah, in this case, we know that your egg came before the chicken.
Yeah. To piggyback on this discussion, because there was another
Cecilia, there's a second part of that question.
Oh.
Yeah, well, and let me just add one other lesson learned. I'd say 5 was kind of the maximum, so having a diversity of parts of the organization represented is certainly necessary. But I think, there's that group of 5, and then there's like a bigger group of about 30 or so people. And so we kind of had this decision point. Do you cook it in the group of 5, or do you try to cook it in this bigger group? And I don't know that you could get there in a group that's larger. So I think the lesson, in fact, even smaller, certainly would have been faster. So if 3, like maybe starting with 3 and then advance it to 5 and then wider and wider, perhaps, I don't know. We don't know how what we didn't do would have worked, but I do wonder if it would speed things along, starting with even smaller. The second part of the question, the second question had to do with can you remind me?
The influence of the George Floyd murder.
Yeah, and Jennifer asked if you can connect the dots between George Floyd and asset equity / investments. So.
Well, I think it just caused a lot of self-reflection, both as individuals participating in a process, as well as organizational reflection on how can we do better, really. I mean, that, and what are the levers that are available? And so, as professionals, we could either say, well, I don't have that lever that can be pulled, but here's the lever that we do have. Like, you wouldn't think that, is asset management a tool for advancing racial equity? I don't know that would, people would necessarily make that connection, but turns out it is. Turns out it's actually really important, and you have to start questioning, like, actually, it turns out accounting is really important, and turns out human resources is really important. to advancing racial equity. And so I think many professions did and still are reflecting on how they can do better. So that's really the connection.
Yeah, and I would just add from a general perspective, you're absolutely right that everybody after George Floyd, some of what we have dealt with racial inequity in this country has to do with the fact that for some of us, it's apparent on a daily basis, whether it's your gender, whether it's your sexual orientation, your color, your religion, you live that and you know the inequities that are out there, prejudice. But then the George Floyd situation for the others who, I don't want to use the word privilege and trigger anybody, but for others who it's not top of mind, George Floyd's murder showed how deeply rooted the discrimination, the prejudice that leads to people feeling fear against another or not seeing another as human. So one of the things that really drew me to using ISO 55000 as a framework for diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, and now we have JEDI with justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, is the fact that it looks at an organization. It starts with the organizational mission. Everybody can gather around the organizational mission. Then it looks to the relevant stakeholders. So this is one of the things, if you look at the relevant stakeholders and you broaden your definition and go get on the bus beyond the usual suspects, you then start looking at the relationships you have with relevant stakeholders as an asset. And so this is what the tool is. And when you start memorializing it, like Portland has done in this instance, you're creating a situation where you've got a tool that will bring it to a mindful level for everybody. So does that make sense? Does that help? I hope.
Yeah, if I can add to that too, I think it's a great point, and that's an example, Cecilia, of where whether you know it or not, you helped influence this policy was because we've had conversations, through our subcommittee, and I've been able to represent some of those perspectives back home. So thank you. And again, to the question of who's not at the table and why aren't they there? And we're very fortunate to have very effective community engagement professionals and start examining not only the who, but the how. What about time? Should people be compensated for their time participating in public process? All these questions should be asked and answered. And there is a set of emerging best practices in that domain as well. That's important. And if I could just add one thing too, is kind of going back to the question about the influence of George Floyd's murder. I can't emphasize enough, at least for me, the importance of self-study in this road. Just like learning about good practices in asset management, learning the true history of the United States. And there are some books out there that are kind of on topic to what we're talking about. The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee actually, gets right at this point. There's a book called Contested Waters by Jeff Wiltz that really gets into the details of the racist history of public pools and the planning and whether pools are kept and why things are the way they are today. I'll just do two more. The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. I think this should be mandatory reading. And I just started Cast by Isabel Wilkerson, which so far is just a fantastic framing and just really deepening understanding. So I think that's really important.
Yeah.
So I'd like to ask Toby to mention some things that Toby spoke at the IAM, Institute of Asset Management conference recently, and had talked about the convergence of equity and asset management. And while we're heralding the equity elements of your asset management policy, it is an asset management policy, and there's some great information in there about things like, if you commit to an asset management plan, you have to show how that asset is going to be maintained through the life cycle of that asset. That's not anywhere else. That's a breakthrough policy. It's not equity related. But anyway, Toby, if you could talk a little bit about the convergence of equity and
sure.
Asset
Our discussion at the Institute of Asset Management, which I wish I had met Chris beforehand, because I feel like it's so on point with some of what we were thinking. It's just that using an asset management framework, not just one element of asset management or investment prioritization, but the entire framework is a much more effective way of advancing inequity within an organization. So it should start at the strategic objective level, and it should then, be aligned. There should be a line of sight with the organizational strategic objectives to everything else that goes on: strategy and planning, asset information, risk. Your policy covers all of this, which is why, it's what you've done. You've addressed racial inequity within the framework. And to some extent, the best way to address racial inequity within asset management is to, good asset management is sort of the best advocate. So all of the processes that are required, the technology, all of the putting a framework in place, or rather, if there is no framework in place, there's really not the ability to advance these measures that you're talking about. And that's, so to me, this is very exciting, because you have institutionalized these concepts within a very practical framework. I think I'm excited to share some of these elements to others, because other organizations are having a hard time defining equity for themselves. There's a generational approach to that. You start, to your point, you start with census tract information, and then maybe you grow from there. So it's just, to me, it's very exciting, because we, as asset management professionals, are always extolling the virtues of setting up an asset management system and standing up an organization. And this is what you've done. You've incorporated it into the system. I do have a question or something, if you could share with all of us, which I found very interesting in the appendix of the policy, where you mention intergenerational equity, like as it relates to capital assets. And I'd love to know what the thinking was, or sort of how you've defined that for Portland.
Yeah, I think Doug may have been the one who brought that to the table. And if you recall, Doug was the one who helped write the IIMM for the IPWEA. So a definition, I'm not going to tout this as the definition, but a definition that has been offered before is where no generation consumes more than it replaces in terms of infrastructure. So by not maintaining, say a portfolio of buildings, or, tree canopy, or replacing your tree canopy, or you name it, in effect, the people living for that period of time are using more than they're replacing, and they're basically making it so that those services and that infrastructure is not available for a future generation, because they're not replacing or setting resources aside at an adequate rate to address that. So they're basically choosing to lower service levels in the future. And there's a lot of different ways to do it, but where it gets challenging is with a lot of our physical infrastructure, these are long life cycles. These are, 100 years for pipes. These are, 50 years for a building and so on, maybe 25 years for a boiler. And so to plan for that requires a system. And without a system, you're not able to plan for those kinds of timeframes. Whereas like a computer or a phone, yeah, we're going to see multiple phones and we're going to replace them because I can think that far ahead and we're going to do it. So I think that's where the system comes into play, really needing that system. But here we are, we're 100 years on for many of the water systems and wastewater systems in the US. And, they're at this point where perhaps they haven't planned for that full time period. And now there's a surge required in investment level that could have been smoothed out over longer periods of time. So that's where you get into generational equity or inequity. There's an analogy to the climate change discussion and global warming as well. Are we consuming more of our carbon budget than we're entitled to?
Yes.
This is interesting because it talks about intentional and unintentional consequences of all planning. And so it's the factors of the appendix really help you focus in on those and work on them. One question I have that goes to a comment or question that Lindsay asked, and we also have to get to Scott's question because that's also an interesting one.
We're going into overtime, don't worry.
I know, but I want to let Scott know we haven't forgotten his question because
Okay.
he was an early question and it's a good one. But to the policy, Chris, you've got the policy, it's past council, it's getting ready to begin implementation through your work with the university. One thing I would ask, because one of the things that Lindsay raised was with the reason minority communities aren't being heard from, that they are or aren't the squeaky wheel, is that they've learned to keep their heads down. I don't think that that's the case. As somebody who's dealt with bringing things to community and talking and translating what is going on, I think it's more that they are not aware of the processes that you normally undertake and where to go to raise the questions or to become the squeaky wheel. And so it's the issue of outreach. And so I'm quite wondering, Chris, whether or not you guys have a planned rollout for disseminating the fact that you have done this phenomenal policy and asking for citizens to raise their hands. And, at what point did you bring the public in and how are you expanding it beyond the usual suspects?
Yeah, so for us in the city of Portland, this policy is kind of, I think in other settings, they might call it the corporate level policy. And then the different business units, it's up to them for how to implement and how to roll things out. For me personally, I like to just do better and then the results hopefully speak for themselves. And so there's no planned announcement or anything like that. What I do anticipate is seeing evolution in a good direction. We are still learning, and you mentioned implementation. Again, this is a starting line, and it's to start understanding, how we can make for better, more equitable outcomes using the tools of asset management, and that's where there's kind of this corporate level effort, and then there's within different business units or departments or bureaus efforts. And so I think many organizations are structured like that, and it needs to work for them. It needs to work in the organizational setting. And I think that's going to be different for everyone.
Mildred, I see your hand raised. Would you mind holding it just for a minute while I thank our organizational members? We just want to make sure that people who only had an hour to devote to this program, that we thank you for coming, and make sure we thank our patron sponsors, especially Definitive Logic, Onuma System, ABS Quality Evaluations, and ABS Group, as well as our other organizational members, especially Strategies Insight and the Andrew James Advisory Group. Again, if you're interested in ISO 55000 professional development, please reach out to the Andrew James Advisory Group for their upcoming course starting December 6th. And if you don't know how to get in touch with them, you can get in touch through the ALN. And with that, carry on, Mildred, and we'll go into overtime.
Okay, so the question I have is, you mentioned how the different business units will be receiving this. They're all at different levels of maturity, right? I think you mentioned that earlier. How has it been received? I mean, can you give examples of, are you encountering sort of a wide range of reaction to this policy, from yes, this is it, we're moving forward, to we're just fine? I'm just curious, because this was done obviously at the corporate level. It's great, but it's about implementing it at the business unit level, and how has it been received at that level? I'm curious.
Well, I will share one thing that we're seeing greater participation in that monthly collaborative group around asset management. So I'd say that's the first indication that there is increased understanding and emphasis on it. And other than that, we're pretty early here, so yeah, not much more. We'll need to get through the budget process and see the results of that and so on. So yeah, but so far, early indications are positive.
Positive. That's good. Now, I mean, the reason that I asked that is because, I mean, I know that where I used to work, the policy was very strongly mandated. So when it was developed, like at the corporate level, like you did, there was like a very, very big, strong push downward, which resulted in this kind of, oh my God, you know what I mean? We have a new mandate as opposed to what you're doing, which is you're allowing everyone to kind of digest it and sort of come to the table and meet them where they are, right? Mm. Which I think is a great way to do it. And that's why I asked that question, because there are many different ways to do it. And you can be very strong corporately, or you can allow it to sort of kind of like grow within the organization. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. And I think maybe our approach was somewhat in the middle too, because that group of five, those industries: transportation, parks and rec, water, wastewater, and facilities. That's not everything. That's not everything that the city's responsible for. But let's say we have a $50 billion asset base. It probably represents $49 billion of that $50 billion asset, or maybe 45. Clearly the vast majority were represented from the get-go, and so that's another approach to look at it that way. So again, it wasn't everybody, but it was definitely the majority were there at the table.
So Chris, I know you're not representing the city of Portland, therefore you're not representing Parks and Recreation, but could the Chris that is talking talk about the Chris who will be acting on implementing the policy that you helped write?
Yeah, sure. I think I'm actually fortunate to be really well supported, and kind of the next step within parks is emphasizing and ramping up our capability around natural asset management. And so I'm going to be adding a position to my team related to natural infrastructure assessment and measurement and managing the data sets for it and everything. Whereas in the past, it's been heavily focused on built infrastructure. So that's kind of the next step for me and for us. And then my contribution to kind of the larger citywide effort is rolling up my sleeves and doing the work on that maturity assessment tool, coming up with those yes, no questions that then will get vetted through a group and hopefully deployed. So that's going to be my personal contribution to that effort.
Is there any interest in having outside volunteers assist with that assessment tool? Is the ALN able to help in any way, or is that something that you are best to do in-house?
Well, I think hopefully it's almost done because it's got to get out there by December. But maybe in a future iteration, because again, the policy passed again just a couple months ago, and I think we're required to do it by December as just a first take. And then the intent is to evolve it from there. So yeah, maybe in the future. Right now, it's just someone had to do it. Someone had to write it. And, so I picked up the pen on that one.
Oh, good for you. And I know that Nick has a favorite section of the policy. Nick, you want to share that before we get to Scott's question? And Marty's got a really good one too.
Sure. Yeah, I was just reading through, I guess, the annex that you sent, Chris, and I picked out a quote, and I forget what part it was under, but here it is either way, and I'll talk a little about why I picked it out, why it stood out to me after.
Can you share your screen? Is it?
No.
No. Okay. Okay.
Asset management is an embedded framework guiding all asset investment decisions. It is not a standalone program, project, or initiative, nor is it an outcome to evaluate against other strategic objectives, but rather a comprehensive approach to making the best decisions in managing large portfolios of capital and natural assets. The goal of asset management is to obtain the best financial return for the public while delivering required service levels at the least life cycle cost and at an acceptable level of risk. And I just loved that statement, the comprehensive piece, especially the concept that this is not a standalone project or initiative, that this is an integration of sometimes siloed activities or departments, and that it needs kind of a line of sight across an organization, and it can't function effectively in its own bubble. And also just kind of the attention to getting back to decision making and the best return on investment based on objectives that an organization has set out, which could be related to service levels or life cycle costs and risk management. So I just thought that said a lot about asset management in a single little bit, and I maybe hadn't seen it put so well, and just love that was incorporated in the Portland policy.
Yeah, that was under the principles at the very beginning of the appendix. So that's it. It really falls in line with what we talk about with ISO 55000 in general, taking a comprehensive view, and the issues of looking at data and the science of what you're dealing with, the history, the background, all of that information, the communications, the technology, all of that is embedded in ISO 55000. And it's something that as you guys go forward, you should probably be thinking about a strategic asset management plan being required for each of your business units, and training them on how to do that, or getting help from someone like an AMCL or even Strategies Insight. We can help you with that. But looking at it where it's mindful, where it's put on paper, where what gets measured gets done. And creating, like you said, those monthly meetings. Remember in our program with Martin O'Malley, the more recent program where he said that we had to have continuous repeating meetings with people, both with relevant stakeholders, both internal or external. And Scott's question went to the issue of the focus of internal stakeholders and the problems, even looking at the internal stakeholders. How do you go around that? I guess his question, where is it? It was at the very beginning, and I think we may not have Scott still online, but he was saying that working in the DoD, Department of Defense, they face some of these issues with equity, but they seem like they would be shifted away from disadvantaged communities to disadvantaged cultures. When asset management policy is created, it seems to lean on skills and interests that isolate some of our core asset managers, white collar versus blue collar, or commissioned versus non-commissioned as examples. Is this an appropriate way to translate this issue? I would say, yes, it's an appropriate way, Scott. You may not be here, but one of the things that in doing the work you did, Chris, with the fractal, the 5 people, which actually studies say that doing work in groups of 5 or that fractal is a very good way to make progress. And then,
interesting. I never knew that.
Yeah. So
you just got lucky.
Yeah, you guys got lucky, but that's important. So that's one thing, that your fractal has to be aware that they only represent a certain number of perspectives, and they have to do outreach themselves offline outside of those meetings to bring other perspectives to the table. And so for Scott or anybody else who's looking at this, you begin where you are and with who you have, but you make the people you have become mindful, like Chris has said. They need to do some of their own training to think about how to be broader in their looking beyond the usual suspects, and how they can think about what unintended consequences would there be of what we're doing here from an equity perspective or a risk management perspective or any perspective. So I don't know, Mike or Chris or Nick, do you have anything else for that? I just wanted to make sure we answered.
Defer to Chris.
Yeah, so to the question specifically, so I'm reading it. I think I'm reading the right one. Yeah. Is this an appropriate way to translate the issue? Yes and no would be my response. So embracing the need to advance racial equity is not supplanted by approaching things based on class or based on, you know, as you termed, white collar versus blue collar, or officers compared to enlisted. Those are very different. And so to say our goal is to address racial equity is necessary, and engaging all relevant stakeholders, meaning that you are including enlisted and so on in that process. So I really like what you said, Cecilia, about, I'll try to term it as being an honest broker of the concerns outside of that fractal, I think is how you termed it.
Yes.
So doing your best to empathize and sympathize with different perspectives, and then checking. So that was the other thing in the policy development process was, you know, we did get to a point where it was like, hey, are we on the right track here? Or are we totally missing something? Mm-hmm. So we'll see. You know, again, we're at this. Let's check in 3 years, and right. is there progress? It's a starting point, and I'm hopeful. I'm very hopeful.
I would say one thing about what you said, because your policy is about racial equity. Our committee is ALN advancing equity, not just racial. And the issue there is some of where we find ourselves in this country with the divisions that we find is that people are fearing that they are not going to be included. And so the equity that we seek is for all. On the one hand, it's important to call out racial equity and the lack thereof in this country and across the globe. But on the other hand, we need to be rising all boats, which is what you said at the beginning, that all boats should be rising equally. Some to rise equally have to be given a push because they are really far down here. So one of the things that I caution for municipalities and organizations that are looking at this, Inclusion means everybody. It means everyone is included, that we're doing this together, that we are coming together, and we're coming together often, we're coming together thoughtfully, transforming transparently into trust. So we're looking, together 4 T's, that we come together on a regular basis, that we talk transparently about where we are today, using facts and science, data that we have access to, raising the history of where we have been and where we are today, and looking together for a vision. And if we do it together, thoughtfully, transparently, we will get to trust, and we will have a difference made for everybody. So let's think about that. Equity. Yep, that is the one.
I thought a little
picture.
Visual illustration would be helpful at this point.
That means everybody gets to watch the game. You don't just give the same box. So cute too.
Yeah.
Especially with the little guy. I always love that one.
Okay.
If I could just reply really quickly to that, Mike. So,
yes.
so I think, like the discipline and profession of asset management, the discussion of equity is going to be organizationally unique, and every organization needs to travel its own journey in that regard and arrive at a point that works. Like, I'm hopeful that this policy, I'm holding it up, will work for Portland. It probably isn't going to work for New York City, or maybe elements of it will, but or for the Department of Defense. And likewise, the journey to understand where we're at socially and what needs to be done is going to be unique too. And so that's kind of a philosophical thing, because you think, oh, I'm going to grab ISO, I'm going to grab IAM, I'm going to slap these standards down, and that's how we're going to do it. No, you need to know about those standards, you need to know about those frameworks, but then you got to adapt them to your own setting. So
absolutely, context sensitive solution. It cannot be a one size fits all, but at some certain points you can use the framework to create that for yourself and for your organization, whether it be a company, a utility, a city, a state. It can be utilized. It's a tool, but all tools are only as good as what effort you put in them, in creating them. And you guys put great effort into this policy. So kudos to you.
One question, Marty's been a very engaged attendee, and we want to address something he's bringing up. And I want to put a little context in it for Marty. Marty has written the E3210 standard for municipalities to be able to assess assets in 15 different categories, 10 different hard asset categories, and then 5 intangible asset categories such as healthcare and education. And he's asking, now that you have an asset management policy that has to include an equity element, many equity elements, how do you engage the community, let them have a say in how the money is being spent and where new money comes from? How do you see, maybe perhaps in your department, how to start balancing all of these different stakeholder voices that now must be included?
It's a great question, Marty.
Yeah, so Cecilia, I think you mentioned the need for developing trust through ongoing dialogue. So that's where we as an organization are moving, is towards ongoing engagement and dialogue and developing relationships. You have to staff it too. Like, that's the other thing. Like, you can't just like swoop in and have a public meeting. And sometimes I will say, often the federal government can be the most guilty of that approach where we're going to swoop in, have a public meeting and say that we've engaged the public. And it doesn't really work that way. You don't develop trust doing that. So that's more the direction that we're headed, and, you know, devoting resources to it, just like we're now devoting resources. We're going to be devoting resources towards the natural asset side of things. Devoting resources to that community engagement becomes necessary. And it requires a leap. Again, like, organizations need to take that leap if they haven't already.
Well, and I would say that you're at the beginning of this. And so as you work, you're going to be working with the university on your implementation plan. So that is an excellent start because they've got a lot of tentacles into community. But you're going to want to start looking at things differently, like social service organizations, the faith-based organizations, all the churches, temples, and mosques that you have in your community. You should be reaching out to them. The YMCA, the YWCA, all different kinds of social service organizations. You need to be reaching out to the radio stations. You need to be reaching out to the minority TV program hosts that are on those cable channels that we have out there. You need to be thinking about all those unusual places that you don't go. Some of the professional minority organizations, whether they be lawyers, accountants, MBAs, the IFMA, the International Facilities Management Association, all these different organizations have people that might be able to bring in some insights for you. And so it's going to be reaching into community differently and exposing community to what your vision is and asking them what theirs are. Because what you said, Chris, is so true. The DOT does 1,000 different programs that are community public meetings, but they're not really engaging, they're telling. And you want to tell your story, but you want to learn the story of the community. And part of learning that is learning the history of the community, figuring out where they've been and what is going on in that community today, and where they think they ought to be able to go and what they think they need to get there, and what your department can possibly bring to that table. What part of the recipe do you have in store for them? Hopefully that helps, Marty.
So I would like to wrap up by asking Chris, how can we help? What can the Asset Leadership Network do to help you promote this, have it be successful internally in Portland? And, you know, if your intention is to influence other municipalities, how can we help there also?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I think continuing our meetings and discussions are certainly helpful for sure. You know, again, I think we're, as a country, learning, and I don't know that there's a widespread understanding of this is a good practice. And by good practice, I mean more than just words on the paper. I mean, we did this and this was the outcome. And this is how BIPOC communities have improved outcomes as a result, or this is how historically marginalized communities have improved outcomes as a result. And it would be great to have a collection of those tools and techniques. And often when that's done, I see them as they're offered by the entity that did it. And so there's a little bit of inherent bias in that, where it's like, hey, I did this thing and it was great because I say it's great. So to add that element of how do you know that the outcome was great becomes really important. So, you know, we did things this way. this was the outcome and this is how we know, and to have that collection of practices related to infrastructure management would be fantastic. And that's a lot to ask of an ALN, but
we can point you to those organizations that have presented and shown how they have done it for their organization, for their assets. Maybe not necessarily their, don't have equity measurements in it, but the Air Force, Nick is putting information about that in the chat, is very well versed in it and is sharing information again on November 9th at 4 p.m. Eastern as part of our program with the Australian Asset Management Council. We've got template slides for people to set up so that there is a repeated process and people can see over and over, here are the value and benefits of their asset management program. So we will definitely point you to things on that.
Great.
And then also, 2022 is the 20th anniversary of the Portland Asset Management group that was formed in 2002. So perhaps the ALN could do something to help honor and celebrate the 20 years of Portland Asset Management initiative that is culminating in this excellent policy. So look for us to champion you in that way, if it's acceptable.
Thank you for that offer. Yeah, I'm not sure what, hopefully 2022 is better than 2020 when it comes to, maybe we'll be out of this mess by then. I don't know.
Well, on behalf of Mildred, Chua-Ulger, and Toby Kizner, who had to leave, Cecilia, Mowatt, Nick Knoke, and myself, thank you for all the work that you've put into it and for sharing your efforts with us. We really appreciate this.
Thank you. And so glad that you're still on our board and that with that ALN Advancing Equity team. So we'll be meeting soon to continue this and get some ideas for performance measurements. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it. And,
thanks, Nick.
And again, there's definitely words in here that were influenced by this group. So thank you.
Yeah, that's the biggest compliment you can give us.
For sure.
Thanks so much.
And thanks to all of our attendees. We hope you enjoyed this as much as we did.
We always have fun, don't we?
Yes.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Ciao.